The Jerry Powell podcast is brought to you by Archstone Foundation, preparing society and meeting the needs of an aging population. And now, here are your hosts.
Welcome to the Jerry Powell podcast. This is Eric Quidera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, who is on this call with us? We have a lot of people.
First, we'll introduce our other guest host, Nazli Abedini, who is a palliative care fellow at UCSF. Welcome to Jerry Powell podcast, Nazli.
Thank you for having me.
And now we will introduce our guests. We have two returning guests from Boston. First, we have Rachelle Bernacki, who's Director of Quality Initiatives and Palliative Care at the Dana Farber Cancer Center and Brigham and Women's Hospital. Welcome back to the Jerry Powell podcast, Rachelle.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's great to be here.
Were you going to say Dairy Pal? I think
Dairy?
Yeah.
A little known.
120th episode.
Hey, cows need palliative care too. Right. So then, also returning, we have Zara Cooper, who's director of the Center for Geriatric Surgery at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Welcome back to the Jerry Powell podcast, Zara.
Thanks, Alex. It's great to be here.
And first time on the podcast, we have Ricky Leiter, who is a palliative care physician researcher at the Dana Farber Cancer Institute. Welcome to the Jerry Powell podcast, Ricky.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, before we get into the subject at hand, we always start off with a song request. Who is the song requester, Alex?
Zara is the song
Zara,
requester.
do you have a song for Alex?
I do. I would love it if you could play Lovely Day by Bill Withers.
And wait, can you tell us why you're requesting this song?
I requested the song because unfortunately Bill Withers died recently.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since his death, I've listened to this song every morning, and it's helped me get a good start to the day. So
Yeah. All right, I'm just going to play a snippet at the beginning and then a little more at the end. When I wake up in the morning, love, and the sun, it hurts my eyes, and something without warning, love, weighs heavy on my mind. I'm going to stop there, but we'll get more at the end. Lovely day, lovely day, lovely day. Great choice. Bill Withers, one of our favorites in Jerry Powell podcast. We did Grandma's Hands a few episodes back. Wonderful tunes.
So, this is, I think, like our 8th podcast. We're focused on COVID, and I'm starting to hear a lot more kind of reports coming out of Massachusetts and Boston. Can you guys just give us like a heads up what's happening right now out there, and what are you seeing in your hospital?
Well, in Massachusetts, we have about 32,000 cases, and as of this morning, we had 1,245 deaths. We're one of the top, I think, 4 states in terms of cases and deaths. We all work at Dana Farber, which is a cancer center, and then the Brigham, which is a inpatient hospital that has about 1,000 beds. And today we have 143 confirmed COVID cases and 78 in the ICU, and 65 persons under investigation or PUIs, which is odd name. And of those, palliative care is involved in a lot of those. So we've actually done a huge amount of restructuring of our palliative care team to sort of meet the needs. And I'm going to tell a story about Zara. So when this first started about 3 or 4 weeks ago, Zara instantaneously kind of said, "Oh my God, this is going to be really hard. We're not going to be able to see our patients and families. How are we going to do this?" And I, very blithely said, "Oh, we're going to be there with you, Zara. We're going to help you. Palliative care is going to help you shoulder to shoulder." And at the time, we literally had no plan. And a week or 2 later, after huge efforts on the part of our team, Jane and Nelia, everyone in our palliative care department sort of reconfigured. And Ricky is actually the person that was on service with Zara last week or 2 weeks ago and was shoulder to shoulder with her taking care of these patients. So I feel super grateful that I work in a place where that can happen. And it's been really hard to try to figure out how to make this work. We reimagined ourselves about 5 times before we came to a stable place. So the teams that we have right now, we have our regular kind of palliative care consults where the census is down, and most of that is happening via virtual consults, and there's about 20 patients there. In the ICU, the team that Ricky is leading, we're embedded in the ICU and we're following 35 patients there. So about half of the patients that are intubated at the Brigham Palliative Care is involved with.
Can I just pause there for a second?
Yeah.
So you said 78 ICU patients, so you could fall in about a half. Like, how many ICU beds do you usually have? Because that seems like a lot of ICU patients.
Yeah. So we have 4 ICU teams right now, and it's been climbing kind of linearly, I'd say. And actually, for the last week or so, it's been kind of hovering around 60. But I have to say the ICU at the Brigham team and the hospice teams have capacity to take a lot more than that. So we're kind of already ready. We have empty teams kind of ready to take more patients. Luckily, the growth hasn't been so, we've had a fair amount of time to plan for this. Right. So the growth hasn't been overwhelming.
Yeah.
And we've sort of been caught off guard.
And, when I look at like the IHME model, again, there's a lot of stuff on whether or not we should trust these models. When I look at Massachusetts, it says that you guys are still like 2 weeks away from the peak. Is it feeling that way? Or do you feel like, things are settling a little bit?
I can speak to that a little bit. As an intensivist, I can say that it does not feel like things are settling. They're getting busier. What we've done is we've actually added 5 new ICUs to meet the demands of the epidemic. So we do have a huge ICU capacity. We also have a separate building called the Shapiro Center, where those beds are negative pressure beds, and they have the capacity to become ICU beds. And so we've transformed 3 different floors to become ICUs to meet the demands of this crisis. So there's been a lot of physical and structural transformation to do that. And the approach has been, as far as staffing goes, to actually increase the capacity of each ICU. So the census of each ICU, the limit went from 10 to 15 and is now going to 20. So instead of opening additional ICUs, we're adding additional clinicians to each ICU to do that. And that progression has happened. The rapidity with which that progression is happening is increasing. So it is linear in the sense that we haven't gotten this huge kind of tsunami that we have been expecting and prepared for, but it is definitely happening.
Mm-hmm. And Ricky, can you give us a flavor from on the ground in the ICU? What's it like to consult in these patients? What are the typical issues that you're dealing with? And, how is it day to day?
Short answer is hard. I think we really had no idea what to expect when we started there. We were doing a lot of planning behind the scenes. And then eventually we Jane DeLima Thomas, our clinical chief, and I kind of said, look, we just need to get in there. So one of our fellows, Sam Gelfand, and I just started. We said, we don't know what we're going to do yet, but we're going to embed ourselves. We're going to start talking to the teams and start seeing patients and how we can help. We're doing primarily goals of care, some end-of-life symptom management, but I would say 90% of our consults at this point are for assistance with goals of care. And it's tough. I think there are sort of COVID-related communication challenges and also sort of clinical challenges. Communication, as you know, none of the family is there. So every one of our patients is alone in the room, and we're calling these patients' family members over the phone, having really hard conversations where we can't see them. Over the last couple of weeks, we've sort of increased our technological capacity where we can do family meetings over Zoom and FaceTime and what have you. That has its own challenges too. But I think that's really hard, in that family members can't see the patients. We can't really see the patients. We're not going to the bedside because we're trying to preserve PPE. So all of that makes it really tough. I think, the technology, when it works, it's great. when it doesn't, it's hard. I think Zara and I did the first sort of Zoom family meeting in the ICU, and it was challenging. I mean, if multiple family members wanted to Zoom in, they couldn't get on. They're just logistical challenges that ended up with one family member and me sort of staring at each other, waiting for everyone else to hop on for a few minutes. So I think it took us a while to get into our groove on how to do these. But I think everything communication is harder, right? When you're trying to work with an interpreter and we're seeing, a large number of Latinx patients who speak Spanish. And so it's challenging to loop in an interpreter. It's an added, just the added difficulty there. And then I think clinically, these are really sick patients, and many of whom weren't sick beforehand, right? These aren't the patients who had cancer who've been in and out of the hospital for months and they've heard, families have heard that they've been sick before. We're delivering a lot of bad news and trying to have goals of care conversations at the same time, and that makes it challenging. And then on top of that, I think that, the level of trauma and emotion is something that I wasn't expecting. So we've had now 2 couples who I've taken care of, married couples who have both been intubated doors apart in the ICU.
Oh my gosh.
And it's terrible. And I think, talking to the family member, the daughter said, I can't even go there. I can't think about the hard things. And how could she think about the hard things? So I think that was something that surprised all of us or struck all of us at first. And I hate to say we've gotten used to it, but we've kind of come to expect that type of story when we're consulting on these patients.
Wow.
Yeah.
And when you first said that the level of trauma, I'd imagine to the providers. I mean, do you worry about how you're going to come out of this or how other members of the team or the fellows are going to come out of this? There's this just devastating New England Journal paper recently about, resident experience in Detroit. We've seen more death in the last 2 weeks than we've seen in our entire lives.
So yeah, I think we're all worried about it. We're spending a lot of time in our group debriefing the difficult cases, spending time sort of talking with each other. I think, Zara and I had an experience on that same family meeting once we got it up and running, where the patient's son felt guilty. He's the one who got sick first. And so he felt like he had given COVID to his mother and his mother was going to die and it was his fault. And he said over and over again, she's going to die. It's my fault. And I'd seen the pictures from New York with the bodies being put into trucks. And that's what's going to happen to my mom. And there were 4 palliative care trained people on that call. And I think none of us knew how to respond to that in that moment. So I think it's hard work, and we're all trying to process it together. And I think it's sort of an ongoing project going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that story. Rachelle, I know that you were talking earlier about how you were going to, how you reformatted the service, and we took you deep into the ICU. Are there other aspects you wanted to get to about the service?
So, in terms of hospital medicine, I think we've had longstanding relationships with that group, and we've sort of integrated with them. We run our lists with them every day, and that works pretty well. The place where I would think it's been the most challenging has been the emergency department. We have really tried to come up with a structure to help them, and we came up with this Jerry Pal COVID pager to screen patients, and we tried that for a week and we never got a call. And so we were like, okay. So Lynn and I work with a really talented PA named Lynn O'Mara, and she's now trolling our emergency room department list for people who are over 70 and maybe came from a nursing home or have dementia or have other functional decline. And then we're proactively reaching out to those clinicians in the emergency department and asking, can we talk to the family? And that has actually worked pretty well. We've done about 20 of these so far, and we've had, I think, a really good impact. I think the emergency room clinicians are, of all the clinicians, I think the most stressed. It's been really, really hard for them. They're sort of, by the time they get to the ICU or the time they're on the floor, the patient's already kind of has a trajectory. And for the ED, they're sorting that all out. And so trying to figure out how we can be most helpful to them. It's been a work in progress for sure. We did an education session yesterday with the PAs over Zoom, and it was my first experience doing Zoom rooms and drills. And it really worked. The PAs said, wow, wouldn't necessarily like say that emotional response in response to a question about information. And I was like, yeah, so why might we think about doing that? So that's been really fun. And I think hopefully meaningful. And yet the challenges of working there are so great that I don't think I just want to be perfectly honest, we don't have it figured out yet, how to best meet the needs there. It's pretty hard.
And you weren't really in the emergency department much before, is that right?
No,
so this is a frontier area, and you're trying to ramp up a whole service in there.
Yeah.
And our first podcast about COVID was with Daryl Owens, and he talked about how he was on call 24/7 for his small community hospital in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle area. But he had, robust buy-in from his emergency medicine providers. In his case, the challenge was more the hospitalist group had trouble with him having the goals of care conversation. It sounds like in your case, it's sort of the opposite. Like you get a lot of acceptance in the wards and the floor and the ICU, but the emergency medicine, they didn't call your pager, even though it was called the Jerry Pal pager, which is a great name for a pager. So it took some work of case finding. You have to be proactive, and maybe that's a lesson for our listeners.
Yeah.
Rachelle, absolutely. I'm actually just curious, sort of in that same vein. I know you said this is still a moving target to figure out how to be most helpful, but are there some pearls or some key things that you've taken away in terms of things that you've learned are helpful?
Yeah. So I think emergency department clinicians are pretty protocol driven. So Kay Alici and I kind of came up with a guide, a serious illness guide. And I do think that having structure in times of high anxiety is helpful. So we've been, kind of promoting that guide. There's a real tension because we haven't used it that much. And I don't know if it's actually tested yet, but it seemed to work. I used it on a patient, and it was actually a patient who was kind of around the time of intubation and had an opportunity to talk with her sister and talk about whether this was really what we wanted. And the patient, I think one of the lessons for me has been really creating a space to really deeply listen to a patient's family. And so this patient's family said to me, Dr. Bernacki, I just don't understand why we need to intubate this patient, her right now. I don't understand that. And so that really led me to sort of dive in and think about it together with the ED. And that patient never actually ended up getting intubated and is hopefully getting discharged soon. So that's been a real lesson to me. And I think the other piece of that story that I like is, I think when you're working with a new group, instead of trying to tell them what you can do, you have to kind of show it, right? So you show, not tell. And so that patient, where I think we were helpful in the emergency department attending, sort of felt like it was very useful, and then sort of communicated that to the rest of their group. So I think that's one lesson for me. I think that's the best way to sort of get in and get sort of recognized. And at the same time, I'm still hearing that, there's still really difficult situations where they feel like they could use even more help. Like when someone comes in and is really short of breath and they haven't had a conversation about intubation before, and maybe the patient has, a lot of comorbidities or is very frail, and they feel like they can't really have a good conversation, and we're not always right there in the ED. So
I think, speaking as a client, I would say that having Ricky and his team there as a constant presence, or knowing that he was coming at a certain time every day, we would just run the list, and he would tell me the patients where he thought he could be most helpful. And I think that really that constant presence that Rachelle overpromised in the beginning was incredibly meaningful. When I was the ICU attending, Even being somebody who can have these conversations and has palliative care training, having, as cliche as it is, that added layer of support for us, for the nursing staff, somebody to communicate with the patients more richly while I was, running and proning somebody. I mean, it was incredibly helpful, but that constant presence, the problem with a pager or something like that is it requires this activation energy that you just don't have when you're constantly running from crisis to crisis. And so that's why I think, Lynn's approach of really identifying the patients proactively is incredibly helpful because, when you're just trying to make sure that somebody's not hypoxic, you're not always thinking about that, even though that's what's actually causing everybody the moral distress.
When we talked to Daryl Owens and Jim Wright, part of what was heartbreaking there is they were like one of two people doing all of these goals of care conversations, and Jim going 7 days a week to the ED, just like phenomenal that he was doing it. You guys, you have a deeper bench, but I can imagine that sooner or later that bench starts to thin. How are you thinking about your Jerry Powell workforce in meeting this demand?
We've thought a lot about it, and I think, and this kind of relates to Nazli's question too, is like when we started, every week, Rachelle mentioned it, we kept blowing up the service. So 2 days later, we said, it's not going to work. And we scrapped everything. We did something else. And then, we said, well, what we're doing now, it's not scalable. It's not scalable. And so we got really nervous about it. And we eventually said, you know what? That's okay. It's okay that it's not scalable because it works today. And we don't know what the census is going to look like tomorrow or next week or 2 weeks later. But if it works now, let's do it as long as it's working and then think about what we're going to do when the census creeps up. So we've done, the leadership of our group has been just absolutely phenomenal, as Rachelle mentioned, in thinking through how best to use our bench. So we have, on the ICU team, we have 4 or 5 clinicians, and I'd say 3 of the 5 are in-house every day. And then there are 2 sort of virtual backups who can do the family meetings from home over Zoom or over the phone. And that sort of model, the in-house people plus the virtual backups, is what we've done across the service. So our regular consult service, the ones who are seeing the palliative care patients who are still in the hospital are, I would say, 90% virtual right now. They're doing all of their work from home. So we're really drawing on all of the resources that we have and trying to use everyone on our bench as best as we can.
Mm-hmm. It's great. And I should note, Eric and I we are the virtual backup for Columbia in New York. And we're taking care of a very elderly, sick woman in the ICU there and having family meetings with her daughter and granddaughter, also with a Spanish translator. I want to come back to you, Zara, and talk more about what's it like to be an intensivist and what sort of challenges you're facing in that role as you're trained as a surgeon, intensivist, and in palliative care. What has this been like for you?
It's been, it's a different disease. I mean, that's what has really struck me in taking care of these patients. Before I went on the unit, I refreshed about ARDS and, proning and vent settings and all this stuff. And what I've come to appreciate is that there are some nuances here that we really don't understand yet. And that, when we were in medical school, we learned about all of these diseases because people before us had all this experience, and then they wrote books about it and they could tell us, well, this is what you expect. And here we are with an entirely new illness. And there's definitely stuff that we can take from, our prior learnings, but there is also stuff like Rachelle mentioned, with respect to timing of intubation, over time, we are starting to reconsider that. I mean, I think, I was, one of the intensivists to open up one of the early units. And so we were 2, 4, 6 intubate, it's like if you got to 6 liters after that, we were going to intubate. And now what we're realizing is actually, some of those patients who are on 7, 8 liters but are doing okay, they don't need to be intubated even if they're sitting with a SAT in the 80s. It's not pervasive, but it's hard to get a sense of the rhythm of this illness. And so that's been really difficult. And the other issue is that from a palliative care standpoint, the whole thing has prognostic uncertainty, right? I mean, nobody knows. This disease was discovered in humans, less than 6 months ago. So everything we're doing is we're really all still flying by the seat of our pants. So there's really no data to guide us. But I'm also struck by, from a geriatric standpoint, there's actually a lot of data to guide us, and I feel like we're not using it, I mean, we know. What I mean is that we know that an 85-year-old who has multiple comorbidities, who already had physical disability and functional impairment, is not going to do well after they've been on a ventilator, paralyzed and prone for 4 or 5 days. We know that. Mm-hmm. And it has nothing to do with COVID. It has to do with the way that we're treating the disease. And so I think one of the major challenges that I've found, and has actually caused me a great deal of moral distress, is that we're almost forgetting some of the things that we've learned from like Lauren Ferrante's work and all the great work that's been done at Yale by Tom Gill's group about, the course of older patients after critical illness. And we need to really, instead of just saying, we have no idea how this is going to turn out, I think we actually need to apply what we do know about how some of these folks will do after surviving critical illness.
Yeah. And apply it in terms of the conversations you're having with family about what to expect if we continue with this current trajectory.
Exactly. And also in thinking about goals of care. Mm-hmm. Thinking about goals of care, because one of the major communication challenges, we've said it before, that the family can't be there, but it also means the family can't see. And so as an intensivist, one of the things that I struggle with is that the ICU is like a foreign land to people. They really have no idea what to expect. Mm-hmm. And now it's even worse because they really can't see the machines, and they can't hear the beeping, and they can't see, the 4 or 5 people coming in to turn their loved one. They can't see them in a coma. They don't see all the visual and auditory cues that we rely on to say, hey, this isn't going well. Mm-hmm. We don't have any of that feedback for them. And so it really is, having discussions with them in a complete vacuum, which is really challenging.
Now, I can imagine, and just talking to others who are in the thick of things, that one of the struggles that we face doing palliative care consultations is we generally, the mantra is that we don't go into these conversations with agendas, but like when you're in the thick of things, when you're in that setting, you see somebody decompensating, you see that people are starting to talk about CVVH and all of these other things in this person, where the outcomes, while may not be certain, are certainly getting pretty darn close. Where and that we also are worried about not just potentially our safety, but the safety of the teams doing things like CPR. That it's hard to hold on to that mantra of don't go in with an agenda. How are you guys dealing with that?
I think I can take that one. I struggled with this. I just want to name it, like really struggled. Our team, especially seeing patients on the floor, it was really hard because our normal sort of way of doing palliative care consults is to get to know the patient, kind of understand what they want, and then later make recommendations. And there's a way that in this circumstance that it can feel like you should be making a recommendation earlier, potentially for DNR or for not intubating. And this is one of those times when I feel like our team kind of really sat down at the end of every consultation and kind of did this quality improvement process with the conversations. And did that feel right? Was that the right thing to do? And so I think where I came to at the end of, I was just on and passed off the service to Josh this week, is that we did make recommendations. We said things like, most patients get better on their own, because a lot of the patients I'm seeing on the floor are in a couple of liters of oxygen. But yet at the same time, I know they're really frail because we've done a really good functional assessment. And I'm worried about their kind of long-term outcome. And so we had been saying this, like, I hope they continue to do well, but I'm worried that they could get really sick really quickly and may even die from this. And then sometimes made a recommendation. And what I found, and often, like Ricky said, most of our conversations have been through interpreters, which adds another layer of difficulty and complication. A lot of the patients' family members that we were talking to were saying, because a lot of our patients also had concomitant delirium, we're saying, I hear what you're saying, Dr. Bernacki, but they're not that sick right now. And so, I prefer to keep them full code or, whatever. And, and I actually, the way I sort of have come to frame that is that we are providing some anticipatory guidance or kind of preparing people for just-in-time decision-making, like Rebecca Sidori talks about. And so we have had a number of those patients then later in the course of their hospitalization decompensate. Some of them have done well and gone home, and that's been great, and some of them have not. And then our palliative, we've been changing the pager. The pager's been pretty busy, so every night we change to a different attending, and a lot of the teams will page and they'll have conversations. And for most of those patients, they've converted to intensive comfort measures. And I think what I've kind of come to actually talk to my mom about this, but said, even though those conversations are incredibly hard, I think there's a way that we're helping to prepare people for what might happen. And but I have to say, I felt conflicted about it, and I actually reached out to Muriel Gillick this week because I felt like I just wanted to talk with her about, like, is this the right frame? Is this the right way to think about doing this? And it was actually really therapeutic to do that. So,
What did she say? We had Muriel on the podcast before, by the way. She's such a great thinker.
She was so thoughtful, and one of the she's really worried about the nursing homes. Extremely worried about that. But I think what I also wanted to hear is. I felt like this need from a geriatric perspective to sort of feel like we're doing the right thing. You're doing, and so she offered some fine tuning and things like that. But overall, that felt better because I think there is just a huge amount of, even though we've done all these things, we have a deep bench, we have a lot of resources. I just want to name that it doesn't feel like enough, like in a really deep way. That's hard. It's really hard. So
yeah.
If I may actually ask a little bit more about that, I've heard now from all three of you that moral distress is really something that's coming through, and being in this uncertain time certainly amplifies that. And I'm wondering, in some ways, it's almost like we as palliative care have to turn the mirror onto ourselves and palliate ourselves in this process. And I'm wondering, how are you doing that for yourselves?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think a lot of it is what Rachelle said. And we're doing, we've done a similar thing on the ICU that she's been doing with the hospital medicine and the ED palliative care team, which is regular debriefing. I mean, we've been sitting in a room together having these conversations, each one of us kind of trading off who's leading. And then after each one saying, did that feel okay? Did I push too much? Did I go too far? Did I not push enough? There was one day where our team collectively had sort of 6 hard code status end of life conversations in a row. And we all walked out sort of shell shocked. And then on my way home, I called one of my mentors and I said, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing here. Like, is this right? Like, am I overstepping? Is this what I should be doing in palliative care? And we talked about each case, and it was appropriate in each case. But I think that, Nasli, you're right. Like, we need to look at what we're doing. And I've been sort of saying jokingly, but I think the message is important, is that those little voices in our head that cause us to question what we're doing are super, super important these days, because there's so much uncertainty. This is uncharted territory for us, and we should be questioning what we're doing. I think that will save us from looking back and doing things where we look back 2 weeks from now, 2 months from now, and say, wow, we got that completely wrong because we were in the thick of things and we couldn't see our blind spots. So I think the more that we can sort of be very introspective and then also debrief with colleagues and kind of check ourselves, the more deliberate our practice is going to be, and the sort of more we protect ourselves against really kind of sticky ethical lapses going forward. But it's hard. It's really, really hard.
Mm-hmm. And just to sort of name explicitly what you're talking about, the moral distress, if I'm understanding you correctly, is primarily feeling like we pushed pretty hard for CPR and for a DNR in this case. And we're not sure that's the right thing to do because there's so much uncertainty about the potential outcomes. And we are presenting a very grim picture of what the future might look like for a person who's full code and is sick with COVID. And yet we don't really know. We have a lot of data that pushes us in that direction. We have data about older adults with disability, et cetera, that pushes us in that direction. But, like you all said, we have that data, and yet it's so early in the process. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, for a lot of these patients, I felt comfortable with the medical outcome. I mean, I think for someone who has ARDS, who is not oxygenating well, despite being, prone and paralyzed, and has been in the ICU for 7 days, kind of getting worse, we have a good sense that CPR would not be medically beneficial for them.
It's certainly not going to be better than the grim statistics of in-hospital mortality. And that, like, the data coming out of Wuhan is that 4 out of 120 people were alive at 30 days after cardiac arrest in the hospital. Like, that's again, it's early data, but it just goes to show you that we do have some, and especially for frail older adults, we have some before COVID that also, I think, can be reasonably applied.
Yeah. And I think, Eric, I'll give a shout out to your Twitter thread the other day about prognostication in COVID, which we circulated among our group and among some of the ICU clinicians as well. It was really helpful. So thank you for that.
And if anybody's interested, we also created on the Jerry Powell webpage, we have a COVID prognosis page now that includes prognosis for individuals in the ICU, the data that we have so far, and the data that we have with cardiac arrest.
Yeah, so I think, some of the moral distress is related to the uncertainty, but some of it is that we are making stronger recommendations earlier in conversations than we normally would. It doesn't feel like our standard palliative care cadence. It feels a lot more heavy-handed than my typical practices, than all of our typical practices, and that's what I think has led to a lot of distress among our team.
That's a very eloquent way.
I would say on the other side of that, when I was signing out the unit to one of my colleagues, I'm signing out our list, and he's like, "What are we doing?" So, there's a flip side to that moral distress where, Rachelle will get a call from an ICU attending, like, "What are you doing down there in the ED? Why are all these patients coming up full code? Why are they coming at me?" And it's because there are these varying phenotypes. And, I think that there's been a lot in the media, rightfully so, about these young people who we see who have had nothing, to precede this, and then they get this life-threatening illness. But there are also a lot of folks who have other medical problems that are baseline and are, really making it difficult for them to recover. So, I think there's moral distress kind of all around that. And then, of course, there's the moral distress. And I think to what you're talking about, Ricky, is this vacuum where, again, as I mentioned, the families are operating without their normal cues, but we're also operating without our normal cues. We can't actually go in and see the patient. We make no connection with them. We don't have that physical assessment. Have you examined my mother? Have you seen my mother? Well, sort of. Through a glass door for about it's really difficult. And then we also don't have the family at the bedside to help us better understand where this person fits into their social structure. So, I think everybody's just feeling really discombobulated right now because all of the things that we normally rely on to tell us where we're standing aren't there.
Mm-hmm.
I had this interesting sort of experience of feeling stuck in the middle, and I'll explain it, but our ICUs, they know me. One of the things that's really important, at least for me, has been having this longstanding relationship. So I'm calling with a transfer to the ICU, explaining that I've had this conversation, and I understand that this patient's prognosis is really poor. But at the same time, at the other end of the phone is this healthcare proxy I'm talking to via an interpreter, and they, really feel very strongly that this patient go to the ICU, and so. I've never felt kind of squeezed by both sides so much before. It's been that piece has felt really challenging. So And I can see it from both sides. One of the other things that I'd say about these sort of debriefings is the importance of like hard conversations between our trusted colleagues, like where someone's really digging in. And I'll just give an example with Josh. Like Josh and I have a great relationship, but I'm like describing this and he's like, why are you saying that? Are you worried about resource allocation? And to be honest, I'm not really worried about crisis standards of care, but he's really kind of pushing me to say, these are the reasons why I think this is the best course of action and really defend myself. And I actually really appreciate that. And in the moment, it can feel incredibly hard to be pushed that hard, but actually it sort of allows you to sleep at night, and say, okay, yeah, that was really good. I talked it through. And even with that, I still have these kind of nagging. I had patients where it's just so hard. I had a patient on Easter who was in the hospital, and his wife they both had COVID, and one was dying at home. They could be there with each other, and that feeling sort of like there's not, whatever we do, it's not enough, for those kinds of situations. It's just, that's the heartbreaking part.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I'm hearing you all talk about this, I'm hearing you say that not only is the practice of palliative care right now not feeling normal, but it's also just everything else is not feeling normal as well. And I'm hearing this from experienced clinicians, and putting on my fellow hat, which I wear very well. I'm wondering how it's been for your learners on your teams and what you're doing to help them, think about the fact that this is not normal, because I could also see it going the other way where they may be imprinted with this non-normal way of practicing. How are you guys thinking about that and dealing with that?
Yeah, I think it's been tough. And also we're at a stage in the year where they're ready to fly. And I think the inclination at first among all of us was to say, there are fellows, there are learners. We've got to protect them from this. We've got to protect them from everything that's going on, and like, let's maintain some normalcy. Mm-hmm. And they bucked. I mean, they said, no, you're not going to do that to us. We want to be in there. We want to be in there with you doing this work. And so they're in it. They're in it with us. I mean, at this stage, they're acting like essentially attendings, right? You talked about how we're deepening our bench. They're right there with us. So I think that, they've been on the front lines in all of our services, kind of integral parts. And I think that, Jane DeLima-Thomas and Kathleen Doyle, the fellowship directors, have really taken the approach of, let's show them how this is working. I mean, this is like this amazing. I hate to say anything in a pandemic is an amazing opportunity, but there's a way that they could see how a service can restructure and really dig into that in a way that they wouldn't be able to do in other circumstances. So they've been involved in every aspect of our division's response right from the beginning. And we're spending a lot of time debriefing with them, and checking in with them. And I think that at this stage in the year, they have a sense of what the gold standard palliative care is, and they understand that this is not that, and also how to adapt under certain circumstances. I mean, I can't say enough about how they've been doing. They are just amazing. Well,
I'm wondering, as far as the last question is, maybe if each of you we have a lot of listeners who, like in San Francisco, we're waiting for something to happen, potentially volunteering elsewhere. But if you could give us a tip or a lessons learned, maybe one for each of you, could be either of that. Maybe Zara, we can start off with you.
I'm just smiling because I was hoping I would go last.
I figured Z always goes last, so I wanted to reverse alphabet. As somebody whose last name ends with W, like I feel.
Well, yeah. Well, I guess one thing I would say is, this probably won't surprise anybody, but we haven't been quite that introspective with our learners. So that's one thing that I've learned in surgery. Maybe we should do that a little more. I guess, there's a lot of, we cannot help but use this as a learning opportunity. And, I have actually, it has been incredibly affirming and valuable and meaningful and rich to kind of be shoulder to shoulder with so many different types of clinicians and learn from them in this very multidisciplinary way, because we're all just right there, right in it. And so I think approaching it with openness and curiosity, honestly, is really the best approach here. I think, the only way that we're going to get better is if we acknowledge where our gaps in knowledge are. And so I think that's one thing is just, no matter what you read, it's going to be wrong 2 days later. Whatever protocol you memorize, it's going to be different tomorrow. And so you've just got to be prepared to keep up. And then I think the other thing that I would say is to try and pace yourself. And I think, this is such an emotionally wrought time for everyone. I mean, we didn't even begin to talk about the fact that, forget about our professional careers. Personally, we are also living through this pandemic, and each of us have our own, issues that we have to worry about with this. And everybody that you're with, it's not just you. It's as if everybody that you're working with is grieving. Everybody at the same time. And so, we have to have tolerance. We have to have patience. We have to have respect and appreciation in order to get through this together. And I really think that is critically important. And I've been really, really, really heartened, doesn't even begin to do it justice, but really gratified to see that.
Wonderful. Ricky, how about you?
Yeah, I would say I sent a text to a colleague in another city the other day. I was like, man, can I, I'm not going to give gold standard palliative care. Can I just give bronze standard palliative care? Would that be okay? And I think sort of reframing our expectations of ourselves. And, Rachelle mentioned earlier that it just feels like we're not doing enough. But to constantly remind ourselves that we are doing the best we can. And that's still pretty good, right? We are still helping families. We are still helping our clinical colleagues. That's okay. We're not going to be able to give the palliative care we're used to giving, but we're going to do the best we can for as long as we can, and that's okay.
All right, Rachelle.
All
Last to you. You're talking to 2019 Rachelle Bernacki. Doesn't even know what to expect.
So one practical and one sort of more spiritual. The practical is we have an app. Mark Zane put it together, Palliative. It's been so helpful because the number of requests for education and videos is just astronomical. It can feel completely overwhelming. And so that's been super helpful. And we've had a lot already prepared. So that's one thing. And then the second piece is at the end of my time, Madeline Arbright wrote this beautiful piece, a best response to disaster is resilience. And I just love this quote. When asked about my outlook on world affairs, I reply, I'm an optimist who worries a lot. These are not the best of times, but they're not the worst either. It might do well for us to view these abnormal days as an opportunity to ask more of ourselves. And that to me was really inspiring at a time when I felt really tired. And I think it really sort of pushed me through the next, teaching session or consult. And so just to be ready for that, the resilience piece, and Zara sort of mentioned it as well, is really important. And then being forgiving. I love Ricky's sort of bronze standard. I think we have a lot to offer here, and we are kind of helping to make this a little bit better for our patients and families and ourselves. Mm-hmm. So
I truly want to thank all of you for everything that you're doing and for joining us on this podcast. I think for me personally, I find it incredibly helpful just to hear what people are going through. It kind of relieves some of my anxiety too. I think the hard part that we face in some of these cities like San Francisco is it's this waiting. It's this, is it going to happen? And also this feeling of, and we've talked about this before in other podcasts, of the survivor guilt of feeling like, things are kind of slow here, but elsewhere they're getting hammered. So I really just want to thank you. Maybe Alex, you can end a little bit more with that song.
A little bit more of the song. Thank you to all three of you. Really appreciate you being on the podcast. When I wake up in the morning, love, and the sun, it hits my eyes, and something without warning, love, weighs heavy on my mind. Then I look at you, and the whole world seems alright with me. And just one look at you, and I know that it's gonna be a lovely day. Yeah, love the day, love the day, a lovely day. Yeah, love the day, love the day.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, need a little of that. I agree, Zara.
Yeah.
Times like these. Yeah.
I gotta say, despite some of the heartbreaking stories that we're hearing from you, you've just made my day that much more lovely. So, Zara, thank you for joining us. Ricky, big thank you.
Thank you.
Bernacki, it's always great to see you again.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us, you guys. That was really fun.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely.
And thanks to Archstone Foundation. Thank you to all of our listeners. Make sure to like us on whatever app you're using to listen to us and spread the word. We will see you next time. Thank you.